Every NFL season always has a bunch of new teams that make the playoffs. So in today's video, I want to talk about 5 NFL teams that made the playoffs in 2023 that I believe could potentially miss the playoffs in 2024. Hi you guys. So of course, we're going to be talking about 5 2023 NFL playoff teams that will not or potentially will not make the playoffs in 2024. That's not to say that each one of these teams will miss the playoffs. It's just which teams are most likely to miss the playoffs to let some room in for some new teams to enter the playoffs in 2024. And if you go on to enjoy today's video, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button, but let's get into the list. Starting off at number 5, I'll be discussing the Miami Dolphins. Now, I had a hard time picking this number 5 because there was really 2 teams in the same division that could have been put at this number 5 spot, and that was the Buffalo Bills and the Miami Dolphins. Both of these teams went through a lot of different changes this offseason, mainly on the defensive side of the ball for both of these teams, but for Buffalo, you lost out on guys like Stephon Diggs and a couple offensive linemen. But ultimately, I have a lot more faith in that Buffalo Bills team in general, especially because of Josh Allen, to put them over the team like the Miami Dolphins because I don't have as much faith in somebody like Tua. With that being said though, if I had to put money on it, I would probably bet that Miami does make the playoffs, but if it was between a team like Miami or Buffalo to get into that wild card spot, I would probably have my money on Buffalo. The Dolphins have a really good team, and I think offensively speaking, they're going to have another awesome season. My big question for them is how much continuity is this team going to be able to develop halfway through the season? As I mentioned, they have a lot of new pieces and a lot of new faces playing a lot of meaningful snaps for this team in 2024. And when you look at the offensive line and some positional groups on the defense, they're going to have to adjust and make a lot of maneuvers to get this offense and defense rolling as they were at certain points last year. And as we know, Miami typically starts off the season very strong and then kind of fizzles out towards the back end of the season. And with the team looking the way it is and with the chemistry this team potentially might not have, I do have a little bit of question marks about how good they're going to be right out the gates, because if they for some reason through the first 8 weeks have like a 4-4 or a 5-3 record, then I think that's looking kind of bad for this team. Because as I said earlier, we all know that this team does kind of fizzle out once they get kind of figured out and learned later in the season. So if this team for whatever reason doesn't have a spectacular start to the year, I'm a little bit concerned about what they may be able to do to end off the season, which could potentially put them in jeopardy of potentially missing a playoff spot. Again, I want to reiterate, I like Tua. I like a lot of the pieces on the offense and defense. Obviously, Tyreek Hill is maybe the best player in the entire NFL. According to the top 100, he is the best, which I'm not going to lie, I think is a bit of a ludicrous take. But regardless, they have the talent on the team. In my opinion, they have a great coaching staff. It's just going to be up to this team to kind of break out of the pattern they've been in the past couple years of having a good start to the year and then fizzling out towards the end. For this team, I want to see them come out the gates playing well and finish the season playing well, just as a team like the Chiefs typically do. But next up at number 4, we will be discussing the Dallas Cowboys. Again, similar to the Miami Dolphins, if you were to ask me whether or not I think the Cowboys will miss the playoffs, and if I had to put money on it, I would probably take it on the Cowboys making the playoffs. But as I said in the intro of this video, this is not a video on teams that will, this is the teams that could potentially miss the playoffs, and I think Dallas is one of those teams. Ultimately speaking, the NFC in general has gotten a lot better, and when you look at the NFC East in general, the Philadelphia Eagles right now look like the best team in that division. And if Philadelphia were hypothetically able to win the division, which at this point I would predict that they will, then Dallas is going to be fighting for one of those 3 wild card spots. And when you look at the other teams in this conference, like the Seattle Seahawks, the LA Rams, the entirety of the NFC North, and many other teams, it does start to put to question whether or not the Dallas Cowboys can make those wild card spots. And in the offseason, I thought the Dallas Cowboys had a relatively decent offseason. Obviously, we all know their free agency class was very lackluster, but they have been a tad bit more aggressive as the offseason has gone on. In the defensive line, I had a lot of question marks surrounding their depth options, but now they actually brought in a couple pieces like a Carl Lawson, some defensive tackles, so I think the defensive line is a tad bit better. And all in all, I actually am a big believer in Mike Zimmer, so I do think the defense is going to be totally fine. But my real question marks come within the offense and the coaching staff. Because as we sit here as of when I'm making this video, CeeDee Lamb still has not been signed, and while I do think he will be signed, if for whatever reason he is not going to be playing in week 1, then I think this Dallas Cowboys team would be making, 1, a massive mistake, but they'd also probably be losing a lot of games because they don't have their number 1 offensive weapon. Again, I'm going to make the assumption that he will play for this team come week 1 because he is such a massive part of their offense, but damn, they got to pay this guy right now and pretty dang soon because they're going to need him for week 1. Similar to Miami, I have a lot of faith in a lot of the players of the Dallas Cowboys, but question mark wise, I just do not believe in Mike McCarthy nearly as much as a lot of other NFC contenders. And for this Cowboys team, if they are unable to win like over 11 games, then I think there's a chance they potentially miss out on the wild card in 2024. But next up at number 3, we'll be discussing the Cleveland Browns. Now, there's a lot of similarities to the Dallas Cowboys and the Cleveland Browns, but in some ways, they're also very different. It's kind of one of those fun little comparisons between two teams that can make the playoffs but won't make any sort of deep runs. But for the Cleveland Browns, I think that they still have one of the league's best defense. Yes, they lost a couple of pieces and we don't really know what version of Nick Chubb we're going to get. But ultimately speaking, for me, my lack of faith in the Cleveland Browns just really comes down to their quarterback position with Deshaun Watson. If you've looked at any like TikToks or YouTube videos on Deshaun Watson, then you would know that statistically and basically on film, he is one of the most conservative quarterbacks in the entire NFL. Now, I'm not sure if this is by design or if this is just his decision making, but he is one of those quarterbacks that does not, unless they're wide open, make aggressive plays downfield, which is so bizarre because at Houston, he was just super aggressive. But in this Kevin Stefanski offense, he's been a lot more of just kind of a check down merchant and somebody who's just going to hand the ball off. He is kind of what everyone thinks that Brock Purdy is, which Brock Purdy's not that, but Deshaun Watson kind of is. And for a team like Cleveland, which is in the AFC and more specifically in the AFC North, where there's going to be the likes of teams like the Bengals, the Colts, and so many other teams that weren't in the playoffs last year that are going to be fighting for playoff spots in 2024, then it's going to be up for the Cleveland Browns to potentially have to fight off other teams to make the playoffs. And unfortunately, I just don't know if they have the offensive firepower to match up with those other teams. Yes, they have this really good and awesome defense that I think matches up with basically any defense out there, but it really doesn't matter if your offense is that bad. At the end of the day, I don't believe in Deshaun Watson one bit, and while I do believe in the coaching staff and I do believe in this defense, I have a hard time buying into this offense. I know they brought in some receivers and the offensive line should be healthy and Nick Chubb will be healthy, but man, I just have a hard time buying into Deshaun Watson being my quarterback. And ultimately, I could be wrong. Deshaun can come out there and have an awesome 2024 season and look like his old self, but I haven't seen that guy in several years, so it's really hard for me to buy in on this Browns team. And as I said, when you look at the rest of the AFC, a lot of teams are getting much better and a lot more healthier, and yes, Cleveland will be healthy next year, but I just kind of think those teams are better offensively, and I just don't know if the defense can make up the difference. However, next up at number 2, we'll be discussing the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, I think these next two teams were two teams that kind of were a tad bit, I don't want to say lucky, but a tad bit lucky to make the playoffs in 2024, and I think that luck might run a little bit dry in 2024, and that's going to be, of course, the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think the Pittsburgh Steelers are a good team, but man, similar to the Cleveland Browns, if you can buy into Russell Wilson and Justin Fields, then man, you are a lot more optimistic than me. I just cannot buy into those quarterbacks one bit. We've already seen them in the preseason and it has not been pretty. They put up, I think, 3 points combined despite both Justin and Russell playing the entire game, which is totally embarrassing, by the way. And thus far, I mean, it just has not looked good. Arthur Smith is their offensive coordinator, and while I like Arthur Smith, I just don't think he's a great fit for this team. I believe that he is a bit more of like a Tennessee Titans type of guy. Of course, that's where he got his name kind of known for, but that's kind of the style that they had with Derrick Henry. To be honest with you, I think Arthur Smith would be a pretty good fit for a team like Baltimore, especially if Derrick Henry was in his prime. But now we're talking a team that doesn't have the greatest run blocking units, and then you don't have the greatest running backs, so it's kind of a weird unit. But all in all, I still think Pittsburgh's going to be a good team. Because you look at the quarterback room, and yes, as much as we think that Russell Wilson and Justin Fields suck, they're clearly better than Kenny Pickett was last year. But my big thing about this Pittsburgh Steelers team is that the rest of the AFC has just gotten so much better, whereas a team like Pittsburgh has gotten better, but just not quite as much as those other teams. And not to mention, even if the quarterback room was still like really good, I would just still think the other teams are better, because ultimately I don't think this team is as talented as those other ones. Like, yes, I think the offensive line has talent, and yes, the defense is obviously pretty dang good. And of course, I'm expecting some development in some of the younger guys to take bigger steps in 2024 as well. But as we sit here when I'm making this video, and after watching their preseason and watching their camp, camp, I just don't have a bunch of faith in their offense to really match up with those other really upcoming teams like, yet again, the Colts, the Jets, the Bengals, so on and so forth. So if you were to ask me and you had asked me to put money on it, I would probably say that Pittsburgh won't be making the playoffs in 2024, which obviously is going to piss off a lot of Steelers fans, but to be honest with you, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. You could probably have a really bad season and then draft your franchise quarterback next year or the year after and then have not to worry about Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. And of course, at number 1 is going to be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, a lot of the similarities, but at number 1, we'll be discussing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. For Tampa, in my opinion, this is just a team that just doesn't stack up with the rest of the NFC at this point anymore. Last year, they were kind of, I don't want to say lucky, but a tad bit lucky to make the playoffs. They were in the worst division in the NFL and only still was able to win 9 games last year, but they still managed to make the playoffs. And while I do think this Buccaneers team is somewhat solid, like yes, you have guys like Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, solid enough offensive line, a decent enough defense, and of course Baker Mayfield as your quarterback, but I just kind of think your team is just very, very mid to okay. And being mid last year in that division was capable of winning the division, but now that you have a team like the Atlanta Falcons, who I think are going to be pretty good next year, I don't really think that being mid is going to be able to win that division. And because I believe that Atlanta will win the division, that obviously does not leave a lot of room for the Buccaneers to make the playoffs. If they're going to win the division, it would likely have to be through a wild card spot, which would mean they'd have to win more games than the likes of the Dallas Cowboys, potentially, the LA Rams, the Seattle Seahawks, the Green Bay Packers, the Chicago Bears, hell, even Minnesota if things work out for them. And I'm not even talking about a bunch of other really good teams that could pop out next year. So for Tampa, yes, they could be a better team next year, but you lost your offensive coordinator, your team relatively stayed the same, and you still have Baker as your quarterback. So that's just, in my opinion, not a great recipe for success in 2024. I think that they're currently kind of going through a bridge gap quarterback situation with Baker Mayfield. I truly do believe at some point they're going to go out there and draft a new quarterback, maybe next year or the year after that, maybe after Baker's contract is up. But I just have a hard time imagining that this Buccaneers team is really serious about winning championships as long as they have a guy like Baker Mayfield. If I was them, I would hold on to him for as long as I can, but when a guy like a Dak Prescott or one of those top quarterbacks becomes available in either trades or free agency, I would be super aggressive in pursuing them, just as they were with Tom Brady when they won their championship. But that is going to conclude this video. If you guys agree with my list or if you disagree, let me know in the comment section below. And if you have a difference in opinion, let me know your list, of course, again in the comments, and I'll make sure to respond to your comments. But again, if you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.